Jimmy Fallon was in the middle of the interview when Diane Keaton froze. He followed her gaze toward the audience and saw the man sitting in the fifth row. Then tears started streaming down Diane's face. It was supposed to be a fun interview. Diane Keaton promoting her latest film. The kind of appearance she'd done dozens of times. Charming stories. That distinctive Keaton laugh. Her signature eccentric style on full display. The audience was laughing. The roots were grooving. Jimmy was in his element, tossing softballs and getting great responses. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. Diane was in the middle of answering a question about her early days in New York theater when her voice simply stopped. Mid-sentence. Her eyes drifted past Jimmy, past the cameras, toward the tiered audience seating on her right. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her entire body went rigid. Jimmy noticed immediately. Any good host would. He tilted his head, his smile faltering. "Diane? You okay?" She didn't respond. She was staring at someone in the fifth row with an expression Jimmy had never seen on her face before, not in dozens of interviews over the years, not in any of her films. It was shock. Pure, unfiltered shock. The audience sensed something was wrong. The laughter died. 300 people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, trying to figure out what was happening. Diane slowly raised her hand and pointed. "Warren?" she whispered. Then louder. "Warren?" Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The cameras scrambled to find who she was pointing at. The audience members in the fifth row turned to look at the man sitting among them, an elderly gentleman in his late 70s, silver hair neatly combed, wearing a classic suit. He sat perfectly still, both hands on his knees, staring back at Diane with tears already streaming down his weathered face. Jimmy looked between Diane and the man, completely lost. "Diane, who is that?" Diane stood up from the guest chair. Not slowly, not carefully, she just stood, her hand still pointing, her voice breaking. "That's Warren Hastings. That's—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She was crying too hard. The Roots stopped playing. Questlove lowered his drumsticks. The entire studio, crew, band, audience, cameras, everyone stopped moving. Jimmy stood too, instinctively stepping closer to Diane. "Do you know him?" Diane nodded, unable to speak, tears running freely down her face, ruining her makeup, and she clearly didn't care. She took a step toward the edge of the stage, toward the audience section where Warren sat. The elderly man stood slowly, his legs shaking, gripping the seat in front of him for support. "Hello, Diane," he said, his voice cracking. "It's been a long time." 35 years, Diane whispered. "It's been 35 years. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1987. Diane Keaton wasn't always the Hollywood icon we know today. Well, by 1987 she was famous. Annie Hall, The Godfather films, Looking for Mr. Goodbar. But that year, she was also struggling. 41 years old, single, wondering if she'd ever have a family, questioning whether her career success meant she'd sacrifice something essential about being human. She was in New York doing a play Off-Broadway. Something small, intimate, a return to her theater roots. The production was running at a tiny theater in the West Village, the kind of place where the dressing rooms were cramped and the pay was terrible, but the work felt real. Warren Hastings was the stage manager. 52 years old, gray starting to show in his hair, a quiet man who'd spent 30 years in theater without ever seeking the spotlight. He made sure props were in place, cues were called, actors got on stage when they were supposed to. He was good at his job. He was also kind. Patient. The kind of person who noticed when an actor was having a bad day and quietly left a cup of coffee in their dressing room. Diane noticed him during the first week of rehearsals. Not romantically, not at first. She just noticed that he was always there, always steady, always making sure everything worked even when the production felt like it was falling apart. They started talking during breaks. Small conversations at first. Theater gossip. Mutual friends. Then deeper things. Diane's fears about aging in Hollywood. Warren's quiet satisfaction with a life lived backstage. His daughter, Emily, who was 15 and the center of his world. Warren was a widower. His wife had died of breast cancer 3 years earlier. He was raising Emily alone, working day shifts at the theater and rushing home for dinner, helping with homework, showing up at every school event. He never complained. Never acted like it was a burden. Diane found herself drawn to that quiet strength. To the way he loved his daughter without needing applause for it. To the way he lived a life that wasn't about fame or recognition but about showing up every day for the people who mattered. They fell in love slowly, over the course of that 3-month production. Coffee before rehearsals turned into dinners after shows. Dinners turned into long walks through New York at midnight, talking about everything and nothing. Diane met Emily. A shy teenager who loved books and was terrified of her father dating someone famous. But Diane wasn't famous when she sat at their dinner table. She was just Diane, helping with algebra homework, asking about Emily's day, fitting into their small Brooklyn apartment like she'd always belonged there. For 3 months, Diane experienced something she'd never had, a family. Not the Hollywood version. The real version. Dinner at 6. Homework at the kitchen table. Warren falling asleep on the couch during late-night movies. Emily laughing at Diane's terrible cooking. It felt like home. For the first time in her adult life, it felt like home. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The play closed in December 1987. Diane had to return to Los Angeles. She had a film starting in January, then press tours, then another film, then award season. Her life pulled her back to California like gravity. Warren couldn't leave. Emily was in school. His whole life was in New York. He had aging parents in Queens who needed him. He couldn't just pick up and move to Los Angeles on the hope that this thing with Diane would work. They tried long distance for 3 months. Phone calls every night. Weekend visits when Diane's schedule allowed. Letters. Actual handwritten letters that Warren would leave at the front desk of whatever hotel Diane was staying at for work. But the distance was brutal. Time zones conspired against them. Diane would call at midnight her time, forgetting it was 3 a.m. in New York, waking Warren who had to be up at 6 to get Emily to school. She'd fly to New York for a weekend and spend most of it sleeping off jet lag. Warren couldn't come to LA. He couldn't afford the ticket, and even if he could, he couldn't leave Emily. In March 1988, they had the conversation. The one neither wanted but both knew was coming. "I can't do this," Diane said, sitting in Warren's kitchen at 2 a.m., coffee growing cold between them. "I can't keep flying across the country to spend 36 hours with you before I have to leave again. I can't keep falling asleep during phone calls. I can't keep feeling like I'm failing at both my career and this relationship." Warren reached across the table and took her hand. "I know. I love you," Diane said, tears streaming down her face. "I love you and Emily and this life you've built. But I don't know how to fit into it. I don't know how to be in 2 places at once. I love you too," Warren said quietly. "But I can't ask you to give up your career. And I can't leave Emily. Not now. She's 15. She just lost her mother 3 years ago. I'm all she has." "I know," Diane whispered. "I know." They cried together at that kitchen table. Then Diane left. She flew back to Los Angeles and threw herself into work. Film after film. Interview after interview. She built walls around that part of her heart, and told herself it was better this way. Cleaner. No messy compromises. No resentment building over sacrifices made. She never called Warren again. He never called her. They made a silent agreement to let it end completely rather than drag it out in painful increments. Diane never married. Never had children. She adopted kids later. Gave them the love she'd learned she had during those 3 months with Warren and Emily. But she never spoke about Warren publicly. Never mentioned him in interviews. locked that relationship away in a part of her memory she rarely visited because it hurt too much. 35 years passed. And then tonight, on the Tonight Show stage, she looked into the audience and saw Warren Hastings sitting in the fifth row. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy looked at the elderly man standing in the audience, then at Diane crying on his stage, then at the camera still rolling, broadcasting this moment to millions of viewers at home. He made a choice. "Bring him up here," Jimmy said, gesturing to security. "Warren, will you come up on stage?" The producers in the control room were screaming into headsets. This wasn't how interviews worked. You didn't bring random audience members on stage. You didn't stop the show for personal drama. Jimmy didn't care. He'd watched Diane Keaton in films his whole life. He'd interviewed her a dozen times. He'd never seen her look like this, vulnerable, raw, completely stripped of the carefully maintained persona every celebrity wore. Warren walked slowly down the aisle, helped by security, his legs unsteady. He climbed the stairs to the stage, 3 stairs that seemed to take forever. When he reached the top, he stopped a few feet from Diane, uncertain. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," Diane whispered back. They stared at each other. Two people who'd loved each other 35 years ago, separated by time and distance and choices that had seemed impossible to avoid. "What are you doing here?" Diane finally asked. Warren smiled sadly. "My granddaughter got me tickets. Emily's daughter, she's 23 now. She's obsessed with your films. She had no idea I even knew you. She just knew I liked the theater and thought I'd enjoy seeing The Tonight Show live." "Emily," Diane said, the name catching in her throat. "How is she?" "She's good. She's a teacher now. High school English. Lives in Connecticut. Married. 2 kids. He paused. "She talks about you sometimes. About that time you helped her with algebra. About your terrible cooking." Diane laughed through her tears. "I never learned to cook." "I know," Warren said gently. "I would see you in films and think, I bet she still can't make pasta." The audience was completely silent. Even the crew had stopped moving. Jimmy stood off to the side, tears running down his own face, understanding he was witnessing something that transcended entertainment. "I thought about calling," Warren said, 1,000 times over the years. "But I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. If it would just make things harder." "I thought about calling too," Diane admitted. "Every time I was in New York, I'd walk past your old theater. I'd look up your name. I'd hold the phone and not be able to dial." "Why not?" "Because I was afraid," Diane said simply. "Afraid you'd moved on. Afraid you'd forgotten. Afraid that what we had wasn't as important to you as it was to me. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming." Warren reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of being carried. He unfolded it carefully. It was a playbill. From the Off-Broadway production they'd done together in 1987. Diane's face on the cover, younger, smiling. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed. "I've carried this for 35 years," Warren said quietly. "Every wallet I've ever owned. Every jacket pocket. It's been with me every single day since you left." He opened it to reveal something tucked inside, a photograph. Diane, Warren, and Emily at the theater, someone having snapped a picture during a rehearsal break. The 3 of them laughing, Warren's arm around Diane's shoulders, Emily grinning between them. Diane took the playbill with shaking hands. She stared at the photograph, at 3 people who'd loved each other and let life pull them apart. "You kept this," she whispered. "Every day," Warren said. "Because even though we couldn't make it work, even though the timing was impossible, those 3 months were real. You were real. We were real." Diane pulled him into an embrace. The audience rose as one, standing ovation, tears streaming down hundreds of faces. Jimmy stepped back, letting them have this moment. When they finally pulled apart, Diane reached up and removed the vintage brooch she always wore, her signature accessory, something she'd worn to every interview, every premiere, for decades. "I want you to give this to Emily," Diane said, pressing it into Warren's hand. "Tell her I never forgot her. Tell her she taught me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up." Warren closed his fingers around the brooch, nodding because he couldn't speak. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Jimmy gave Warren and Diane his dressing room for 2 hours. They talked. They cried. They caught up on 35 years. Warren gave Diane Emily's phone number. The next day, Diane called. They talked for 3 hours. Emily cried. Diane cried. They made plans to meet. The brooch now sits on Emily's bookshelf in Connecticut, next to a photo of her father and Diane from 1987. And Warren never misses The Tonight Show. Every night, he watches and remembers that some love stories don't end, they just wait.